Yes, now it's the Radulich Broadcasting Network, and we are off on a new adventure. I'm your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich, and this is the very first episode of the Mania of Wrestlemania. Now, what's that, you might be asking? Much like our History of Boxing show, we are going through the history of the WrestleMania event brought to you by the WWE. And we'll be reviewing each show, one WrestleMania in order, going from 1 to 36. Talking a little bit about the history of how we got there, a little bit different than the last couple of years and the most recent, event reviews. These are more historical pieces, trying to put them into context, that sort of thing. And, of course, I can't do this on my own. Not unless you just want to hear me read Wikipedia pages. I'm here with the historian himself, Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
As you travel, Mark Radulich, to WrestleMania. Oh, wait, we're not there yet. That's a couple away.
Yep. But we had the exact same, we did the exact same bit on In Defense of the Ultimate Warrior, which I just re-aired, so that's fun.
We did, and we're going to take this plane into a nosedive real quick.
So, let me first... how long have you been a wrestling fan, Pat?
Oh, geez. When did the sun start setting in the west?
So, I'm guessing you were like 4 or 5?
No, I realistically didn't have a choice but to be a wrestling fan, as I grew up a second-generation wrestling fan, as it were, where... My dad was a regular fixture at the monthly matches at Madison Square Garden and the syndicated shows, all that. My dad had cable TV before most people so that he could pick up Georgia Championship Wrestling and Bill Watts' Mid-South. And he was one of the early tape traders from the magazines that when you would look for a pen pal through the magazines, in reality what you were doing was finding somebody who had a VCR in a different part of the country, and you were saying to them, hey, I'll send you my WWF tapes if you send me your Portland wrestling tapes or your Florida tapes or what have you.
Wow. So your dad was the big super fan and you just sort of grew up under him, huh?
Indeed.
So besides the WWE, we're both Northeasterners. We're both from New York. You've ping-ponged between New York and New Jersey. But that's hardcore WWE territory right there. That's all I grew up with. If you had cable, depending on what year you were watching it, you could probably find some World Championship Wrestling in its early years. And I know that for a little ways there, AWA was on ESPN.
And in the 70s, actually, when we didn't have cable TV, or we had the very minor version of cable TV, which was essentially HBO. If you lived in the New York area, on channel 47, which was the Spanish language network, you could actually watch Championship Wrestling from Florida in a full English broadcast once a week.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
But that was a shifty move, in my opinion, by Vince McMahon Sr., more likely because he and Eddie Graham were the two closest friends out of all the promoters, and constantly traded talent back and forth. So I would imagine that was not exactly an accident that they were able to find a broadcast home for Florida wrestling when all of a sudden it was time for Dusty Rhodes to come up to New York or superstar Billy Graham to head down to Tampa.
Yeah, that makes sense. So did you watch all these tapes with your dad? Like, did you watch the tapes from Portland and Florida and whatnot?
Yeah, he had a lot of stuff, mostly from Florida was the big one that we had. Most of the stuff that was out of our territory jurisdiction, we'll say. Fair amount of AWA prior to ESPN, and probably more Georgia than anything else.
Now, as an adult, I know from our chats you spend a lot of time on YouTube and whatnot, going back and watching all things. What are some of the historical wrestling topics you like to investigate? I know you've brought up a lot of Mid-South and a lot of what did Mid-South morph into? What was the three letters?
The UWF.
UWF. Okay, I almost said UHF. I'm like, nope, that's a Weird Al movie. So other than the Bill Watts stuff, what do you like to investigate? What's piquing your interest these days?
Well, now that the WWE network has migrated to Peacock, and I no longer subscribe to it.
Oh, you're no longer on the cock?
I am no longer on the cock. No, never have been actually on the cock, so.
Pat says no to cock.
Not likely to be in the future either. But at the moment, at least, there are some ways around that to find footage from the older territories. Someone's been kind enough, and the WWE still doesn't technically own the rights to this, to upload a lot of Houston wrestling to YouTube, which is fantastic.
And that's Paul Bosch, right?
Yes, that was Paul Bosch's. It's almost weird to call it a territory. It was really more. It was literally just they only ran Houston, and they would have ties to a certain company at a certain point in time. But it's just a lot of good stuff with a lot of big names. Heavy at the time, Mid-South influence at one point, heavy Florida influence at one point, heavy world class influence at one point. So a lot of cross pollination of talent. It's pretty cool, and a lot of the matches are really fun.
So the WWE is what everyone thinks of nowadays in 2021 when they think of wrestling. I mean, people are like, well, AEW. No, the casual people who don't follow wrestling, who know two wrestlers, Hulk Hogan and Steve Austin, possibly a third in The Rock. They think of the WWE. And it wasn't always that way, obviously. We just brought up the whole territory system. But there was a handful of things kind of all happening around the same time in the early 80s that would create the foundation for the WWE, as it's known now, to become the most associated product with professional wrestling. The way the UFC is the most associated product with MMA, even though there's tons of MMA organizations out there. When people think of MMA, they go, oh, UFC. People think of wrestling, they think WWE. But there was a couple of things that needed to happen in order for us to even get to WrestleMania. Not the least of which, and I know we talked in a preamble about where we want to start it, but I actually want to also bring this up. Everyone talks about the Vince McMahon talent raid. Now, with the NWA out there, which was a loose connection of various territories that shared talent, and then you had the one unified champion in Ric Flair, mostly, who was the NWA champion, and he would travel around the different promotions and take on whoever their top guy was. Pat, talk a little bit about, in earnest, when the mass migration of every territory's top 2 and 3 guys started migrating to New York. About when did that happen, and how did that happen?
Really started the end of 1983. The last, kind of the end of summer into fall of 1983 was really the big turning point in Exodus when all this talent started coming to New York. It just so happens that a lot of that followed a professional wrestling event that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina called Starrcade, which was put on by the NWA and featured a large conglomeration of NWA talent working together from the Mid-Atlantic territory, Jim Crockett Promotions, the Georgia territory, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Championship Wrestling from Florida, which were the 3 biggest NWA affiliate territories at the time. And a lot of that was based on, at the time, guys worked on a handshake deal where there were no contracts in place and there weren't necessarily exclusive things. It was, I'm going to come work in your territory, and there was a notice system where if you were going to leave the territory, you would give your notice for a certain period of time. If you were an underneath job guy, you'd give, your 2 weeks notice, and, sometimes they wouldn't even need that from you. They'd tell you, yeah, you can go ahead. If you were a moderately successful name in that territory, you might give a month's notice. And if you were a top guy in a territory, you would give about 6 weeks notice that, hey, I'm going to finish up, so they could essentially, write you off TV or use you to help get somebody else over that might be in the spot they had you groomed for, and then you'd move on elsewhere. And a lot of this had to do with promoters who would reach out to each other and say, hey, you got this guy on your TV. I want to bring him over here. When can I get him? And sometimes you would have trades for talent. There's been some notable ones over time. Memphis and Bill Watts made a trade that saw essentially the Rock and Roll Express break out in the Mid-South territory and later Memphis. And then, Bill Watts sent a kid to Memphis named Rick Rude, who turned into a huge star. And there would be stuff like that. Vince McMahon Sr. was known for eyeing a guy in a territory, and because of the clout he commanded, he'd get whoever he wanted. He'd, call Eddie Graham and say, "Hey, Eddie, this Dusty Rhodes, I need him for a few weeks up north." And Eddie would say, "Oh, of course." And then Vince Sr. would say, I really appreciate that. Hey, how about I give you the Giant for an extra 2 weeks, because Vince controlled bookings on Andre the Giant. And it kind of worked in that vein for a lot of it. So when Vince McMahon Jr., Vincent K. McMahon, bought out Capital Sports from his father, Vince Sr., and turned it into Titan Sports, he still had some leeway with the promoters in that he could call them and say, "Hey, I want this guy at this time," or what have you. And with certain promoters, he did that. With Jim Crockett, he called and said, for example, he wanted Roddy Piper following Starrcade. He said he would like to use Greg Valentine following Starrcade. With some promoters that he had tried to work out deals with prior to this, such as Vern Gagne in Minnesota, who received him very not flatteringly, instead of going about that with Vern, he decided just to call Vern's talent and say, "Hey, I can make you more money if you come with me." So what we got was kind of a friendlier immigration of talent from the NWA to the WWF than we did from the AWA to the WWF, where guys started jumping without giving any notice. Chiefly among the AWA exiles were Hulk Hogan, Jesse Ventura, Mean Gene Okerlund, Jim Brunzell, Dr. D. David Schultz, and the only one apparently who the Gagnes said gave his notice was Bobby Heenan, who is very old school and believed in doing that. From the NWA, we got guys like Roddy Piper, Greg Valentine. Later on, we would get Ricky Steamboat. So a real big deal. From Bill Watts, he would get guys like the Junkyard Dog, who decided not to give notice, who was the top star there. And not only was he crafting just getting top talent away from the territories, if you notice who he was getting from where, he was also kind of United Colors of Benettoning it, where he was kind of getting every demographic that he could. You had JYD for black fans, you had Ricky Steamboat for Asian fans, Tito Santana for Latino fans, and Hogan for everybody. He's American. And then you had Sergeant Slaughter, who was a Chin American, and all kinds of things to cover all his bases.
So by the time we get to 85 in WrestleMania, he's got essentially the all-star team of that era of wrestling. Outside of a few standouts like, the Flairs and whatnot, a lot of the Crockett guys, and then some others who were kind of up and coming in the AWA and Mid-South, for all intents and purposes, WrestleMania at that point looks like the Super Bowl of wrestling just based on talent. And, of course, he's also got Andre the Giant, Big John Studd, who I believe was also Mid-South. So there's that. You mentioned Starrcade. And Starrcade happens in 1983, and Vince McMahon, as you mentioned, looks at that and says, we need to do that. Now, again, one of the roads to getting there was an event called Black Saturday. Black Saturday was when it was TBS, their wrestling, which was Championship Wrestling from Georgia, was displaced in favor of canned WWF programming at the time. And, of course, the audience for as it's been said, the audience for Georgia Championship Wrestling plots and, called the studio and was like, what the hell is this? So go ahead and talk a little bit about Black Saturday, Pat.
Yeah, essentially when Vince took over his father's company, one of the things he did, aside from trying to sign talent, was sign deals with television companies to put his wrestling show on as opposed to whatever they had been showing. One of the networks he approached was the fledgling Channel 17, the superstation TBS, owned by Ted Turner. And one of Vince's tactics at the time was to tell the TV company, hey, I will pay you to put my show on. I will bring you sponsorships and recoup your costs and then some if you put my show on instead of whoever you're working with. And again, a lot of these deals were negotiated on a handshake, not contractual obligations. So in doing this, one of the prime things Vince wanted was to get the TBS time slot, because it was one of the only nationally syndicated wrestling shows at the time because of the strength of cable television, which Vince obviously paid strong attention to. So he negotiated this deal with TBS, and on July 14th, I believe it was, which is easy to remember because it's both my mom's, my best friend's, and Jeff Jarrett's birthday of 1984, instead of turning on Georgia talent, they turned on World Championship Wrestling, which was the name of the show, and were introduced to matches featuring Big John Studd, the Iron Sheik, Hulk Hogan, and Bobo Brazil. And fans were aghast because they weren't seeing Ronnie Garvin and Ole Anderson and Jake Roberts. They saw the Briscoes. In addition to that, not only did they get the time slot, but the Briscoes themselves sold their stake in Georgia Championship Wrestling to Vince McMahon. And Jim Barnett also sold his stake, Jim Barnett had been a revolutionary promoter and held a lot of stroke in the NWA. So they all basically sold out to Vince at the same time. And what we got was on July 14th, Freddie Miller, who had been the co-host of the show with Gordon Soley, introduces Vince McMahon to the TV audience, who makes a promise to them that they'll enjoy their show just as much. And they're getting canned, matches from the WWF strongholds like Madison Square Garden, the Philadelphia Spectrum, and all that. And what happened was a very quick, rapid ratings decline because these were not the guys that this audience had become accustomed to with the storylines that they were involved in, and they didn't want this. This wasn't their wrestling. And I myself, as a young man, had a very similar experience because I don't know how much you remember this, Mark, but on ESPN weekdays around 3 o'clock Eastern, ESPN used to run a wrestling show called the Global Wrestling Federation.
Oh, I barely remember that.
They were based out of Texas and very small, but they had a lot of talent that was recognizable from stints in the WWF, like Axis the Demolisher, who was known as Demolition Axe, Bad News Allen, Cactus Jack was there for a period of time, Scotty Flamingo, who of course would become Raven, and they had some good homegrown talent like the Patriot. And it was a very well put together wrestling show for the most part in terms of how it was booked. And then one day I turned it on and there was this wrestling called USWA with guys like Jerry the King Lawler and superstar Bill Dundee and gorgeous Gary Young. And I've gone on record, I hate the Memphis style of wrestling. It is not entertaining to me, and a lot of the guys who came out of that territory I thought stunk. So to go from GWF, which had actually booked some pretty decent storylines and had a good match every so often, to get Memphis wrestling, I was pissed and didn't ever want to watch the USWA and made a conscious choice to avoid it at all costs. So I understand how those Georgia Championship Wrestling viewers felt when instead of getting Tommy Rich against Ted DiBiase, they got Iron Mike Sharp against Jose Estrada for 20 minutes.
So, step one, and it may not have occurred in this exact order, but basically, step one, talent. Step two, television. Around the same time, and we'll briefly mention this, we heard about how New York became kind of like a magnet for top talent, hither and thither. Pat talked about a lot of handshake deals, a lot of trading, and just outright making them better financial offers than they were getting in their home territories. And so that's capitalism. But Vince McMahon was also doing another thing, and it's become a very nefarious thing. Like, wrestling writers and historians kind of look back at this and go, this is the evil Vince stuff. This is where he was buying territories out. He was offering money for territories to sell out to him the way Georgia had, as we talked about, or he was putting them out of business. It was kind of join the Borg, or we're going to compete with you directly, and may the best man win. And often these little territorial promotions couldn't compete with what was becoming a growing monolith. So just a brief thing, Pat, a little more pepper, a little bit more seasoning and detail on the Vince rolling through the territory system and essentially dismantling it one by one, starting with probably the most famous one because of who they got out of it and the great uptick in talent it created, Stampede Wrestling, which is, of course, where the Hart family came from.
So, not the first time Vince is going to break a deal with a Hart, FYI. Essentially, Vince wanted to run the Northwest United States and part of Canada. But Canada is very firm on some of its laws, and in order to do that, one, the promoter has to be a Canadian citizen, and two, the Northwest United States was largely controlled by a promoter named Don Owen, who ran Pacific Northwest Wrestling, who was not going to sell out to Vince McMahon. And to their credit, the Portland fans may have been the most loyal territorial fans of any, because Portland didn't stop running until 1992. So in order to get a foothold in places close to that region, like Montana, Vancouver, Calgary, the Western Canadian scene, Stampede was his best option. And on top of that, he was getting reviews from people that Stampede had some great talent there that they could use. Among them, Bret Hart, the Dynamite Kid, and Davey Boy Smith. So in 1984, they brokered a deal that Stu Hart, the promoter and owner of Stampede Wrestling, would shut down, and Vince would pay him the sum total of $100,000 a year for 10 years whilst running Stu Hart's old market, in addition to taking on Bret, Davey Boy, and Dynamite. And Stu would be the promoter his youngest son Bruce, or not youngest son, but his son Bruce, who had been the booker of Stampede Wrestling but was not going to be signed as a talent, would also be the promoter of record and would, be on WWF salary as a Canadian citizen, being the promoter of record for WWF events in Calgary and the Stampede territory, while also getting their time slot. That lasted for a year and a half.
And then in 1997, never mind. So, what else, Pat? What other territories gladly sold out to Vince, and then what other ones resisted and were summarily crushed? I know the biggest one is, of course, the AWA. Vern held out for as long as he could. He tried. God help him, he tried. And I'll tell you, the AWA may, there's an argument to be made that while the AWA financially would eventually fall under the burdensome weight of the WWF, had it not been for the AWA and the talent machine that had been created there, the WWE might not have been as successful. They put out, if you think about the second wave roster of WWE that we know from like the late 80s into the mid 90s, that's all AWA guys.
Oh yeah, the amount of talent that came out of Vern's training camp and the AWA is developing them as talent is staggering. You have Kurt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, the Rockers, especially Shawn Michaels of the two, Sergeant Slaughter, Ricky Steamboat came out of Vern Gagne's camp, the Iron Sheik, Ric Flair, Jim Brunzell. Hulk Hogan didn't come out of their camp, but he did develop the Hulk Hogan persona as we know it in the AWA under Vern.
Just as an aside, if people kind of look at the legacy of Hulk Hogan, he was well, sure, he was a personality and obviously a big star, but he couldn't work for shit. Go back and watch his Nick Bockwinkel matches from the AWA. Mwah!
Yeah, Hulk had his working shoes on for a long time, and he could go. He was a big guy who could go. And again, you're keeping up with one of the greatest of all time, and Nick Bockwinkel, which is nothing to sneeze at either. But you look at the dealing Stu had, where they were able to work out an agreement. He's going to take on Stu's son, his son-in-law, and Dynamite, and all this stuff. And agreement made in good faith that was, of course, broken, but you look at how Vince dealt with Vern initially, and Vince flew to Minneapolis to meet with Vern and Greg, said, hey guys, I want to buy you out. And keep in mind, Vince didn't even have the upfront capital at this point to deliver on what he was going to do. He just had a lot of faith in his plan that it would work. Mm-hmm. And at the time, Vern was partnered with a lot of promoters where, yes, he was in principle the majority owner of the AWA, but he had partners in his different cities that he promoted in his major markets. You know, he had a partner in Minneapolis for a long time named Wally Carbo. He had partners in Denver and San Francisco and the big AWA markets that he couldn't immediately say yes or no to. And this is where it gets he said, she said. Greg says after the initial meeting where Vern said he would have to get his, things in order and whatever, says they never heard from Vince again. Vince says he never heard back from Vern, etc. So at that point, Vince just said, okay, I'm going to start trying to take your talent and I'm going to go to your TV networks, and I don't see what's wrong with going to that network and saying, hey, my show's better, why don't you put it on?
Right. And that's capitalism. I just, out of curiosity, has Greg ever talked publicly about how, had it not been for his father, he'd have sold out to Vince, or like lamenting the opportunity that was before them and sort of regretting not taking it when they had the chance?
He's kind of made veiled statements about that, where he thinks had they made a move or whatever, things could have turned out differently. But he's also come out with like some of the most bold-faced lies you've ever heard, like saying that Hulk Hogan wanted to jump back to the AWA in 1990.
Oh, full of shit! No, he didn't.
In 1990, when they were running shows in a half-empty small building in St. Paul and taping shows that featured top stars like the illustrious Johnny Stewart, Tommy Jammer, and no disrespect to guys like Mike Enos and Wayne Bloom, who are a good tag team, but when they're your top act, you're not really a national presence anymore.
WrestleMania 1990. I'm trying to figure out if that was 5 or 6.
That was 6.
Yeah, okay. He's fucking main eventing, in a Toronto stadium. No, he did not want to go back to the AWA. It's silliness. All right. So the point that we're getting to here, and we're gonna come back now to Black Saturday and sort of the fallout from that, because now he's reducing the competition, he's getting TV, he's got all the talent. He needs to start making a move towards creating the super event, but he's spending a lot of money. And, this is not the WWE billion-dollar company we know now. This is the WWF, and he's nearly bankrupt. And things are not going well with this television show on TBS. And who comes to save the day? Who, when he had an opportunity to maybe step on Vince and crush him out of the game before he becomes the evil empire, who instead gives Vince a leg up and ultimately the keys to later on crush him back? Who was it, Pat?
That would be Jim Crockett Jr.
Tell me all about it.
So, at the time, we talked about how the Georgia television ratings are tanking. Really, really bad. And there's a demand for the NWA stars to get back on TV. And again, the WWF had a smattering of a few of these guys at the time, but they weren't in the NWA context that they had been in prior, and they also weren't being booked in an NWA style of programming that the crowd had gotten used to. So Jim Crockett looks at the situation and says, this audience wants my wrestling just as much, because his wrestling style and everything and talent he had, very similar to what they saw from Georgia Championship Wrestling. And Jimmy Crockett is thinking he's seeing the big picture by saying, if I can get that Channel 17 time slot, I can turn things around and I can really make something happen. In addition to Jimmy Crockett, they had also offered the time slot to Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling. But Vince owned the time slot, so in order to get on there, you were going to have to do business with Vince. Bill Watts did not want any part of that and negotiated his own deal to get on to Channel 17, so he was shown on a different time slot than what Vince was being shown at. But Jimmy Crockett, who felt the big picture was getting that time slot to market his product more, paid $1 million in the sum total to Vince McMahon to buy the rights to the World Championship Wrestling program and name and time slot. And the last program that Vince ran was on March 30th, 1985.
which, of course, is important because it's the day before WrestleMania.
So not only did Vince negotiate and make this deal, he did it where he could maximize his visibility for this idea he had and promote the heck out of it, and didn't give the time slot back to the competitor Jim Crockett until after WrestleMania would have already happened.
Shrewd, to say the least.
So the narrative of, well, Jim Crockett paid for WrestleMania is not necessarily correct. Right. The wheels were in motion for that ahead of time, but the $1 million in financing certainly didn't hurt.
Sure. All right, so now we know the foundation for what would become the WWE we know today and how it all started pre-WrestleMania. Now you're going to have this event. You've got a venue booked, and you've got an idea of what you're going to do in your head, but you've got to grow your audience. You've got to get eyeballs on this thing. The argument that we have in modern wrestling today is, this came up a lot during the Wednesday Night War, is that they never could get over a certain amount of fans watching on any given night. You know, sometimes Dynamite would have more viewers, sometimes NXT would have more viewers, but it was always the same total number. They did not grow the audience in the year they had the Wednesday Night War. And so Vince, going all the way back to 85, is thinking that we are never going to be successful with just the niche wrestling fans that are out there. There's only a finite amount of them, but there's an infinite amount of possible casual, not wrestling fans, entertainment fans. And so how do you win those things over? And around the same time that this is happening, the whole television landscape is starting to change. You know, cable television is on the rise, and with the rise of cable television is also the rise of niche, independent cable television channels catering to certain markets. One of the big ones that would become an explosion and a cultural centerpiece, an icon, was music television, MTV. 24 hours of music videos playing all your favorite Michael Jackson and Cyndi Lauper and Duran Duran and all the big hits of the time. And Vince gets involved with MTV, and one of the big single pop artists of the time, the aforementioned Cyndi Lauper.
All thanks to Captain Lou Albano.
Yeah, talk about that. How did Vince clearly sees the writing on the wall? He's, Cyndi Lauper is, she's a girl just wanting to have fun, as the pop charts will tell you. How did we get from that over there, that's what I want, to she's now a part of the family? How did we get there through Lou Albano?
So Lou Albano met Cyndi Lauper at a fundraiser for muscular dystrophy. And they meet, they talk, they hit it off, and Cyndi asks Lou if she'll play the role, or if he'll play the role of her father in the Girls Just Want to Have Fun music video. Sure enough, the song is a mega hit. The video is on heavy rotation, not just on MTV, but on the major networks that started posting music video shows. Like NBC had Friday Night Videos, if you remember. So a lot of rotation, a lot of visibility, and wrestling fans were like, "Oh my gosh, that's Captain Lou Albano in that," and they're like, "Who's Captain Lou Albano?" And it led to a lot of cross pollination between the audiences. And Lou Albano was the conduit for Vince McMahon to be introduced to Cyndi Lauper and her manager and then boyfriend Dave Wolf. And what they did was came up with some kind of plan to maximize Cyndi's visibility by using her to cross-promote with the WWF, and coming up with the idea of Cyndi getting involved with Wendy Richter, who Vince was looking to push as a female star, and again, broaden his audience, because there had never been a strong women's audience for wrestling due to how women's wrestling had been presented for the past, 30 years of a lot of hair-pulling, dragging, and one-piece bathing suits filled out by people like the Fabulous Lula. So there wasn't a lot to cheer for. And Vince was trying to change that perception. And he thought Wendy Richter, who was a beautiful lady with a great physique and had athletic ability and charisma was going to be his conduit to that audience to open it up to girls. And it was the right pairing at the right time for at least a little while. And what they did was got Cyndi Lauper involved with Lou Albano by Lou, who was a heel manager on camera, taking credit for her success and saying he was her manager. And sure enough, that prompted Cyndi to show up on WWF TV on Piper's Pit with the hottest heel in the business, Roddy Piper, with both of them talking, about how, no, Lou, you didn't do that. Lou, you didn't. And then Piper saying, are you calling him a liar, man? And Lou Albano freaking out and talking 30 miles an hour, making no sense and just being a slob. And that led to a big match where Cyndi Lauper handpicked Wendy Richter as her representative against Lou Albano, who managed the women's champion of the last 28 years, not a joke, the Fabulous Lula. And it aired on MTV, and it was a show called The Brawl to End It All, where you had MTV's big music personalities like Alan Hunter, who was their top VJ, and Martha Quinn interacting with Gene Okerlund. And they played some music videos, did some interviews, and even though it was a full match card from Madison Square Garden, they only aired one match. And it was Wendy Richter with Cyndi Lauper in her corner against Moolah with Lou Albano in her corner. And at the time, it did a 9.0 Nielsen rating, which made it the most watched program up to that point in the history of MTV.
So real quick, how big of a fan are you of Cyndi Lauper?
I enjoy some of her songs. I think she's very talented. My cousin John's wife is the biggest Cyndi Lauper fan in the world, to the point where some of her album covers are hung up as pictures in the home, and they have gone to many a Cyndi Lauper show. I'll
tell you, I know Girls Just Want to Have Fun is the one that everyone knows, but I mean, she has some really she has a very pretty voice. I mean, I know she's known for having this really weird voice, and certainly in Girls Just Want to Have Fun, she sort of tweaked it up a bit.
Because she's so unusual, Mark.
She's so unusual. Yes, she is. But she has a very pretty voice, and when she's done, I want to say it's True Colors, which is amazing. She did a song on the Rugrats soundtrack. I Want a Mom, which I thought which is pretty phenomenal. And if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't gotten hip to the Cyndi Lauper, you should check out our link for getamazonmusic.com/W2M network and get a free 30 days of Amazon Music, and you can check out all the Cyndi Lauper you want. You can check out her She's So Unusual album that was huge, her later stuff that less people know about, but is still really, really good. Cyndi Lauper.
And everybody knows the words to Time After Time.
Oh, of course. Time After Time. What a great song. If you fall, I will catch you, Pat. I'll be there waiting.
I'll be waiting.
Oh, hey, the Goonies. Remember that? The Goonies? The Goonies are good enough, Pat.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Goonies.
Took my kids to go see that over the summer during the pandemic.
Yeah, no, totally 80s Pat, not a fan of the Goonies. Right, yeah. Chalk that one up.
Yeah, weird. So go ahead and get AmazonMusic.com/W2M network for your free 30 days of Amazon Music. Okay, so that's the Brawl to End It All, right, which had a sequel. And that sequel was the War to Settle the Score, which then brought in Hulk Hogan. He took on Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, if I remember correctly.
No.
Oh, no. How did that go?
This was Hogan and Piper. This was the big one.
Oh, that's right. Hogan and Piper. Okay. Oh, that, and then years later, the fucking 1996 at Starrcade.
So what we got essentially the Brawl to End It All happened in the summer of 1984. Mm-hmm. And what that led to is those stars were off and running and building a nationwide audience via the MTV promotion, via taking over the time slot on the USA Network, which was at that point in time carried by more cable providers than TBS that they had taken over from Southwest Championship Wrestling. They continued cross-promoting where Cyndi Lauper took Hulk Hogan as her date to the Grammys. They continued this really strong media build through the end of 1984. And once they were able to get everybody in the same place at the same time again, what this built to was they wanted to do another MTV special. And the wheels are set in motion that they're going to do WrestleMania. but they need something big to really gain public interest in it. What they do is the war to settle the score in February of 1985, just a little over a month before they had booked WrestleMania for March 31st. And again, it's a full match card, but it's being promoted on MTV, and they're only going to show on this card 2 matches. They're going to show Moolah with Leilani Kai as her charge going against Wendy Richter for the women's title with Cyndi Lauper. But they're also going to involve the company's biggest star, Hulk Hogan, who now there's a significant interest in due to all this cross-promotion, and you get the guy who's going to anchor your brand in the most visible situation possible against the biggest bad guy that you've created. And I won't say big, he certainly wasn't, but in terms of negative fan reaction to the things he did, there was nobody who had anything on Roddy Piper. So Piper is, at this point, he's been in Madison Square Garden and made the front page of pretty much every sports page in the world by the month prior to this, hitting Lou Albano over the head with a gold record that was presented to Cyndi Lauper, kicking Cyndi Lauper, slamming her husband, and causing a near riot, which is what led to this, and Hulk Hogan trying to take revenge for the Rock and Wrestling connection.
So let's talk now about the other addition to all of this that really shifts it into high gear. Yes, sir. Because what we're going to have in the main event of WrestleMania is the 2 guys that Hogan's been feuding with, Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, which just, I went to look it up really quick, and I didn't get very far. I know there's an event they do around this time where the main event is Hogan and Orndorff. That's
not till later. That's a year and a half from now at the big event in Toronto.
That's the one. That's what I was thinking of. Okay. Me and my brain. So, Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper with Bob Orton, right?
Yes.
And now Hogan needs a tag team partner. Enter actor, celebrity icon, Mr. T from the A-Team. Tell us about Mr. T, Pat. Where did he come from? How did he end up getting involved in wrestling?
Mr. T first got noticed as a celebrity bodyguard that worked for Muhammad Ali, Leon Spinks, and used to hand out a business card that would say, "Next to God, there is no greater protector than I." And he got on TV on there. I forget the name of the show on NBC, but essentially what they had was called the World's Toughest Bouncer Contest that he took part in. And he won this contest on the show twice and really made a name for himself with this colorful personality with his mohawk haircut and these feathered earrings and wearing all these gold chains and talking about pity the fool. And that led to him getting a role in this movie called Rocky III that also, not coincidentally, starred Hulk Hogan. And he was the villain Clubber Lang and had such a breakout performance in that role with his catchphrases of "I pity the fool" and just looking very mean and destructive. And that led to him getting cast on a TV show called The A-Team, which was at the time
one of my favorites as a child.
It was a lot of people's favorite as a child. It was arguably the most popular TV show on network television, and certainly was extremely popular with young boys who looked at this action show and this cast of characters, but particularly Mr. T, who was this big muscled up tough guy, and loved him. And he had been in the Rocky movie and played a boxer.
So I got to ask real quick. A-Team or Knight Rider?
Knight Rider. Not even close.
Disagree. Go on.
So he looked the part and everything. And what they did was, in order to get his involvement in this, Mr. T was one of many celebrities who sat in on the front row at the War to Settle the Score, along people like Andy Warhol, Danny DeVito, all these big celebrities who were sitting ringside at the Garden as if it was, Ali Frazier, because for wrestling it was at the time. And they very cleverly did this bit with Piper and Hogan where the referee was knocked out, and Cyndi Lauper, who was at ringside with Hogan, is in danger because they've knocked Paul Orndorff has run down to the ring and cheated and knocked out Hogan from behind, and now Piper and Orndorff are closing in on Cyndi Lauper, and the crowd is scared to death for her. Who comes to the rescue but Mr. T, jumping out of the crowd and into the ring? And I always remember laughing when Gorilla Monsoon says this is going to be the biggest mistake of his life. But it was necessary for him to say that, because you have T, who's an actor, and no matter what his tough guy reputation is, Gorilla's got to put over the wrestlers first, and he does by saying that. And then sure enough, Piper nails him from behind. Him and Orndorff put the boots to him, and the whole thing goes crazy. And the amount of mainstream press it got was unprecedented, because this stuff just didn't happen.
Yeah, we're not. This isn't modern times where Latin Grammy Award-winning artists can do Canadian destroyers. This is back when trained fighters were portrayed as trained fighters, and actors were not portrayed as trained fighters.
Oh, absolutely. This was, you were still trying to make people believe. People were aware of what pro wrestling was, but the presentation still had to be the same in terms of these guys are the real deal, even if it's a show and you don't want to get in there and tangle with them. So, again, the back page, the sports page of every paper across the country has a picture of Mr. T and Hulk Hogan standing back-to-back in the ring, ready to square off with Piper and Orndorff. And then when they actually make the announcement that we're having an event and it's going to be called Wrestlemania, and the main event is Hulk Hogan teaming up with Mr. T to fight Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, people were saying this is unbelievable, because you had the biggest star in wrestling in Hulk Hogan, the biggest good guy, the biggest, most notorious bad guy in Roddy Piper, and arguably the biggest action television star in the world in Mr. T, all coming together in this event. That alone is pretty huge, but then they keep rolling out the red carpet and naming all these celebrities that are going to take part in the show to boot.
You got Liberace, Billy Martin, Muhammad Ali. By the way, better series of training montage videos. The ones Hogan did with T in the run-up to WrestleMania are the ones Hogan did with Gene Okerlund in their match.
Oh, Gene, not even close. I actually think Gene trained harder than Mr. T.
I still have very vivid memories of Gene Okerlund smoking a cigar and eating pancakes, and Hogan bursting into his kitchen. What are you doing, Gino?
Yes,
I'm trying to have breakfast.
So you put that nasty cigar out.
It's so good. I don't remember a lot from my childhood, but boy, do I remember that.
That's pretty unforgettable.
Yeah. All right, and so Madison Square Garden, March 31st. All the pieces are set. Everything that we've been talking about for the past little over half an hour now has led up to this. And this is the event itself, WrestleMania. And we kick off with Tito Santana versus the Executioner, who was played by Playboy Buddy Rose. Just a quick thing on Tito Santana, because I actually thought he was a New York guy. Where did they grab Tito from?
Tito spent the majority of his time in the AWA and southwestern Texas.
All right, so they bring him in, and he's a worker's worker, and they want to, as rumor has it, they wanted to start WrestleMania off hot with a match that was going to catch the crowd's attention, but not overshadow what was to come. Just something to really kick things off with fire. And so we have Tito Santana versus the Executioner, your prototypical masked wrestler, like everything wrestling is at that point in that time.
Did you ever hear the story of why Buddy Rose was the Executioner and not Playboy Buddy Rose?
No, why?
So the booker at the time in the WWF is George Scott, and George at the time really wanted to use Buddy and use him as Playboy Buddy Rose. He doesn't want Buddy to lose as Playboy Buddy Rose on such a prominent stage in an opening match in short order to Tito. So they wanted him to be there because they knew he could put on a good quick match with Tito. So what they do is they try to figure out, how can we do this? Buddy digs into the bag of Colonel De Beers and finds a mask that we had no idea where it came from, and cuts the sleeves off of a black T-shirt. And if you'll notice on his silver boots, there are 2 strips of electric tape over what would essentially be the name Playboy with a rose next to it to cover up his identity. Now, if you've ever seen Playboy Buddy Rose before this, you know damn well that that's Playboy Buddy Rose because they even give him a pre-match interview.
Mm-hmm. It's really
But
funny, actually.
yeah, but they wanted a consummate worker in Buddy to go out there and have a good match to get the crowd excited about what's going on with Tito. Because despite all the glitz and glam and everything, they're still selling a wrestling product, and you have to make it interesting and entertaining. So they put a very good mechanic in Buddy in who can do a lot of stuff in there with one of the guys who they know is one of the best all-around in-ring performers on their roster in Tito.
So this match is less than 5 minutes long, and it's pretty bad.
Get used to that.
Yeah, these were not long matches. A pretty basic match. What'd you think of Tito versus the Executioner?
For this era and what it was supposed to be at the time, very smart opener. They do some good leg work with Buddy trying to target Tito's leg and to do it and again, as part of the ongoing storyline, Tito's feuding at the time with Greg the Hammer Valentine over the Intercontinental title. Greg had injured Tito's leg. Tito starts using the figure 4 out of revenge, so Buddy goes to target the injured leg, but ends up going down to Tito's figure 4. Good story, good action, didn't overstay its welcome.
And now we get to one of my favorite matches of the very first WrestleMania.
Yeah.
This one I remember vividly. This is King Kong Bundy, straight off his run in Mid-South, where he dumbed himself out of position.
You big dummy.
You big dummy. Who is managed by Jimmy Hart, not yet with Bobby Heenan, and going on to bigger and better things with Hogan the following year, against Special Delivery Jones. Now, again, we talked about King Kong Bundy. King Kong Bundy, again, main staple of Mid-South. He was doing the 5-count gimmick at the time, where he's such a big guy and he's so hefty and he uses his weight on people that he doesn't just put them down for a 3-count. As he tells us in his pre-match interview, he wants a 5-count, which they don't do in this match, but he tells us about it anyway. Who the hell is Special Delivery Jones, and why did they kill him in 30 seconds?
SD Jones was not always a jobber, but at this point in time, his career is winding down. He's kind of up there in years, and so he's someone the New York, Philadelphia, Boston, WWF audience is very familiar with, and there's not really upward momentum for him at this point. So what they did was they took him in there, because SD was always known as a guy who would give a new heel a real tough time, but eventually he's going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to establish Bundy immediately as a force, he just goes in there and just crushes SD Jones in what's billed as 9 seconds. In actuality, it's closer to 25. But you really want to put over this new monster strong. So for him to just destroy SD Jones, who's given tough matches to guys like John Studd, it's a pretty big booking boon for Bundy.
Did they, to your knowledge, did they know that if WrestleMania is successful and they do another one, or at the very least, not even knowing whether or not they do another WrestleMania, but did they know that eventually they were working towards Bundy versus Hogan?
I think at some point it was in the back of their mind that, yeah, we can use this guy with Hulk. I don't necessarily know that it was always WrestleMania 2, and there's rumors that even the initial plan for WrestleMania 2 wasn't Bundy, it was Randy Savage, which we'll talk about later. But you have to think that them bringing him in this strong and his size and his look, that the plan was always at some point they were going to match him up with Hulk.
Yeah, I would imagine, if not on a major television show of some degree or another, he might have had like the Boss Man run or the Kamala run with Hogan, where it was all over the house show circuit.
Yeah.
Next up, we get another workers match. We have Ricky Steamboat versus the man who would go on to become Doink the Clown, Matt Bourne, and again, less than 5 minutes. You
know what stuck out immediately, like in this to me? So Matt Bourne is coming off a pretty successful run in Mid-South at this point, and then he comes in with his new look here of bleach blonde hair with his dark beard, which is very popular among 80s wrestlers, and on top of that, the unshaven chest hair. And he doesn't look in bad shape at all, particularly for Matt Bourne. He actually looks in pretty good shape. He's got musculature. He's stout, but not fat stout. And then in comes Ricky Steamboat,
who is clearly on the gas.
And Ricky Steamboat just looks like a Greek god.
Yeah, he does. No, no doubt. But he has... You can tell the guys that are clearly pumping themselves up because it's not as clearly defined musculature as some. It's that sort of bulgy, balloony type musculature. And when I saw him, because again, I'm comparing him to 2 years from now when he wrestles Savage, and he's a lot slimmer.
Yeah, but you got to remember, too, Steamboat also, bodybuilding was a hobby of his prior to the WWF. When he was still working for Crockett Promotions, he actually would do bodybuilding shows in between, things. But he's going to get into that WWF schedule now of the mid-'80s that everybody says damn near killed them. So he's not going to have any time for bodybuilding.
What was it, like 5 shows a week, 1 day off, and then 2 shows on Sunday?
That was the regular pattern for a lot of those guys. And even then, a lot of those guys wouldn't even go home at a certain point. They'd do 60-some-odd days in a row without going home, which is insane.
Yeah, talk to Metallica about what it's like to be on the road that long.
They're
not asking you to be a fan of theirs. I'm just saying. Their road diary, just on the Black Album never-ending tour that went on forever, like, they've talked about it, like, it changed them as men. Like...
I'd rather be a fan than have to talk to Lars Ulrich.
I'm not suggesting you should. But Jason Newsted has actually talked at length about how much spending that much time on the road without a break can do to someone's psyche. It's interesting stuff.
And keep in mind, these guys were doing it not just, they were doing it routinely for years at a time.
Right.
So, yeah, Ricky's still going to be in shape, and Ricky is a training nut, but he's never going to achieve this size again in his career.
No.
But he just, oh, man, you look at the presentation of him, and this is the first time a lot of the WWF audience is seeing him. He could not have looked any better. And maybe that was intentional, too. Maybe he did try to look like this, but knowing the public eye was going to be on him heavier than it had ever been.
Well, look, I mean, if you think about, like, where he's coming from, he's fairly new to the promotion around this time, and he's coming in, and the guy at the head looks like, is Hulk Hogan. And there's competitive jealousy among wrestlers. There's, you look at a card and you look at a guy on the card and and in the next match we're going to talk about, even like Brutus Beefcake, who I know everyone thinks is a huge joke and everyone knows him as Brutus the Barber and the 97 gimmicks he ran in.
Not wrong, guys.
In WCW. But look how great he looks on this show. There's the Iron Sheik, who, again, everyone knows him now as the weird Twitter guy. And years from now, he's the fatty walking around with Sergeant Slaughter. But here, he's in phenomenal. Like almost every half the guys on this card are huge bodybuilding Greek gods. And so if you're Ricky Steamboat and you're just coming in, you're looking around the locker room and like, if I'm going to stand out here, if I'm going to matter, I better get on the stick, as it were. So I can see where Steamboat might have been thinking that way.
Yeah. But again, to his credit, unlike a lot of those huge guys, Steamboat doesn't lose anything on his speed, on his agility, on what he does in the ring, looking clunky. He looks as polished as he ever does here. And Matt Bourne, he'll go on to greater fame as the original Doink the Clown. But in this match, I was very annoyed by his selling.
Mm-hmm. What was wrong with his selling?
It just looked too goofy for the sake of goofy, almost like he was trying to make Steamboat look bad.
Okay.
And Matt was not a very popular guy in locker rooms anyway at this point. Jim Duggan.
You think he was purposely sandbagging him?
It wasn't sandbagging so much, but he might have just been unprofessional and being like, oh, well, I'm out here to get this guy over. Well, what about getting me over type of thing? Mm-hmm. Which Jim Duggan has routinely said is the attitude he normally saw from Matt Bourne, to the point where they got into a fist fight years later in an indie show. But yeah, a lot of people didn't like Matt Bourne. Hawk, the reason they called him Doink the Clown was Hawk in the locker room saw him there for a tryout and says, well, look who's here. It's Krusty the Clown.
Nice.
But you watch him sell. He takes an atomic drop from Steamboat, and he does what I call the Lanny Poffo genius sell,
mm-hmm.
where he flails his arm and kind of wags his ass like, oh no. For the genius character, it makes sense that he would sell like that.
All right, so on a scale of selling like The Undertaker, which is 1, or selling like Shawn Michaels against Hulk Hogan, which is 10, where was Matt Bourne?
3.
Okay.
Because he sold it, but he sold it stupidly, where I legitimately believe he was trying to make Ricky Steamboat look bad.
Okay.
And so, I think it took away. There's a point where he takes a hesitation to avoid a chop in the ropes, and he ties himself up in the ropes for a second, and then unties himself immediately. What are you doing? You're ruining a guy's kind of real big debut here, and it's a guy who people would get invested in very shortly. And it's a shame because Steamboat was so good at this time. And again, from a visual standpoint, this is the best he ever looked cosmetically.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to the aforementioned Brutus Beefcake with Luscious Johnny Valiant. Pat, who the hell is Luscious Johnny Valiant, and why was he running all over the place and wanting to punch people and could barely put together a thought in this match?
Luscious Johnny V was actually a schoolmate of one Vince McMahon at boarding school. They were on a wrestling team together as youths, and years later he broke into wrestling in Pittsburgh under the name John L. Sullivan thanks to one Bruno Sammartino. Johnny would go on to team up with Jimmy Valiant and form the Valiant Brothers, who were one of the most hated but successful tag teams of the 1970s, transitioning later to teaming with their cousin, Jerry Valiant, before John kind of pulled back and became a manager and commentator due to a very abrasive, quick-witted personality and very colorful sense of style.
So he is paired up with who's doing a male gigolo stripper type gimmick in Brutus Beefcake. Real quick, Brutus Beefcake, Hogan's buddy, was from where exactly? Where did they draft him from?
At this point in time, I don't remember where we last saw Brutus prior to coming to the WWF. Mm-hmm. I think the last time I had seen him was in the AWA as Ed Boulder, if he was using that name at that point.
But this whole match is really... First of all, this is an excuse to get Bruno in front of the camera.
I was going to say, who's he wrestling?
He's wrestling David Sammartino, the son of New York royalty and a wrestling legend, and the heavyweight champion for 107 years, Bruno Sammartino.
Who gets the biggest pop thus far of the evening without anybody coming close when he comes out with David.
Bruno Sammartino.
And you look at... we're talking about physiques. Now, again, Beefcake looks phenomenal here, his physique. Mm-hmm. You look at David. David looks like a fire hydrant. And that's not to say he's out of shape, because he's not. But David is a very short guy, very short arms. He's just built like a human fire hydrant. Like, you look at this guy and you're like, oh, he's playing fullback on a college football team at the time. He's not particularly well defined or anything like that. He's just a block.
What has David talked about how he's another one of these second generation guys who could not get out from under their dad's shadow?
He's blamed it on politics and things of that nature, not taking any of the blame himself. Okay. Sorry to say.
So this entire match is constructed once again to we want to get all the stars that we can get our hands on out in front of the camera, and Bruno's not going to wrestle, but we can get Bruno out there with somebody, and who better than his son? Let's do Bruno a favor. He's one of our favorite sons. So David gets a match. He gets a match in there with a good-looking dude. Like
let's just do Bruno a favor. Yeah.
And again,
certainly not for Bruno to end up doing favors for the next 3 years.
Sure. And then, of course, then the crowd can say, "Yay, it's Bruno!" And of course, this is the longest match of the night so far. Other than the main event, this is the longest match of the entire card. It goes almost 12 minutes, and this is a lot of nonsense.
Oh, it sucks! It sucks. Listen, you just tried to defend Brutus Beefcake. Brutus Beefcake sucks. If he is not in there with a Randy Savage or a Ted DiBiase, his match is not going to be good because he's not very good. If he's not teamed with Red Valentine.
I was going to say, is that what they ended up pairing up with Valentine because they realized that once the bell rings, you are worthless?
Yeah, that's a lot of it. And again, like, you look at this match, half of it, and I'm not exaggerating, at least I don't think so, you might be able to... Half of it is Brutus stalling and going to the outside of the ring to talk to Johnny V.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, the stars of this match were not the guys in the match. I barely remember David. But I remember I remember Luscious Johnny Valentine practically doing, like, Bam Bam Bigelow-esque cartwheels through the ring, just beside himself.
The biggest reaction to the match is at one point, Brutus, towards the end, thank God, Brutus throws David to the outside, and Johnny V's right there and scoops him up and slams him, which provokes Bruno to come over and kick somebody's ass, and the crowd just goes apeshit when Bruno starts getting physical.
Mm-hmm. They'd have saved themselves a lot of time and energy if they had just done 5 minutes of Bruno versus Luscious Johnny V.
Yes, but then they wouldn't be making Bruno think that they're going to push David.
I understand. All right, the next one. Always the bridesmaid, but never the bride. The second most popular guy in the Federation for the next couple of years, really. Mid-South's own Junkyard Dog takes on Greg the Hammer Valentine for the Intercontinental Championship. And again, like, second to Hogan, he's, like I said, one of the most popular guys, and maybe Andre. He's the most popular guys in the WWF, and they keep putting him in these marquee matches. Years from now, he's going to have this long-running feud with Harley Race over the King Crown, and he's going to be in all these different positions, and it's like he never gets a belt. Just never. There's always some sort of shenanigans. And later on, when he gets too heavy, and I can kind of see it, but the road to getting there, man, poor Junkyard Dog. By the way, have you been watching...
He's kind of on the road to becoming the junk food dog right now.
Well, I was going to ask you, have you been watching Young Rock?
Oh, God, yeah, not good. I can't watch any more of it, to be honest. It's just really not a good show.
It's horrible, but I brought it up only because, I continue to watch it because I want to know what Jim Cornette's talking about. That and I'm committed. But the other thing was when he started doing the I want to be the penthouse dog bit, and I almost threw something at the television because I'm no wrestling historian, but even I know that's bullshit.
Yeah, well, 90% of what's in that show is, so... Oh, sorry, did I say that out loud? Sorry, presidential candidate Johnson.
Anyway, Junkyard Dog Greg Valentine, what'd you think of the work in this one? For all 7
It's a
minutes
lot of Greg doing all the work, and JYD not doing a lot, other than Howland is doing his
JYD grabbing them cakes.
Yeah, grabbing them cakes. Again, you're talking about Valentine right now, who's really at the peak of his powers in the WWF for his run. He's the Intercontinental Champion. He's in a very bitter, awesome feud with Tito Santana. And Greg is just a really smart, well-schooled heel. He's trying to make the most of this match with the dog, who at this point in time is really not committed to training or working out or giving a shit other than collecting some checks for doing not a lot, which is fine. Good for you, dog. I would have got away with it too if I could have. But the story of the match is kind of Valentine will try every little thing. Dog doesn't take a bump. He headbutts Valentine, and Valentine's bumping all over. And they get to what's initially the finish, where Valentine pins the dog with his feet on the ropes, only to have Mr. Nice Guy Tito Santana come down and explain to the referee what had happened. And Tito's such a good guy that the referee believes him immediately with no question and restarts the match.
You're right, Tito. We need to fix this now.
So, in true heel fashion, Valentine says, "The hell with this, I'm going to take the count out and keep my belt."
Right.
And a lot of people in hindsight are like, well, why wouldn't you just book Valentine versus Tito for this show? Well, the thing is, this was WrestleMania. There was no big show on the horizon after this. So 90% of your business is geared towards the house show market.
Right.
So you need to preserve Tito and Greg for those house shows to draw that money and get that interest. And eventually, I believe it's in June in Baltimore, they do the eventual Tito-Greg title switch in a steel cage, which still to this day has my favorite finish of any steel cage match.
Which is?
Tito climbing up over the top, getting down over the other side. Valentine is about to climb out the door to beat him to the floor, and Santana swings over and kicks the door into Valentine's head and drops to the floor to regain the title.
Well done. All right. So the Iron Sheik, he broke poor Bob Backlund's back, and he took the title, the Evil Sheik did. Oh, those Iranians, those evil people in the early 80s and the late 70s. Only Reagan could defeat them. And then, of course, he gets killed by Hogan in, 10 seconds. It's just ridiculous. Hogan just rode in on a tank like Rusev and just rolled over the Iron Sheik. And, of course, it's the one clip from that match that they showed for decades upon decades after that is Hogan holding Sheik, holding the one leg in the air and just rocking like he's having a seizure. I could barely keep his hands clasped, but he beats the Sheik, and of course he's the man. And if what feels like a mea culpa to the Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, more to the Sheik, they defeat the U.S. Express, because there's lots of choo-choo trains in wrestling. Barry Windham and Mike Rotundo. Barry Windham,
managed by the captain.
Yes, Barry Windham, who we would know would be associated with the Horsemen in years to come, and Mike Rotundo, who would go on to be IRS.
And give birth to a demon and a Believer.
Whew, I don't want to talk about it. All right. So this is 7 minutes. Sheik and Volkov before he became an embarrassment to himself and everyone around him, versus the U.S. Express of Barry Windham and Mike Rotundo to win the tag team championships. What do you think of this match?
I actually really like this match. All four guys had their working shoes on. With Barry at this time, that's not a surprise. People tend to forget what a good worker the Iron Sheik was prior to him discovering Crown Royal and Coke and other stuff. But man, Sheiky Baby was really great. I loved seeing him bust out a drop kick in this.
Wasn't he like an Olympic athlete?
Yeah, Sheik was. Well, he was an Olympic alternate in Iran for 1968 for Mexico. But again, to even get to that level in a country like Iran that breeds itself on high-level wrestling is very impressive. Mm-hmm. He was the head coach for Vern Gagne's wrestling training camp for years. Sheik, again, in his time as the great Hussein Arab before he became the Iron Sheik and then eventually transitioned. Great worker at one point in time. Really, really good.
So I have another A or B for you. Original Sheik or Iron Sheik?
I'm a fan of the Iron Sheik. I understand the original Sheik's historic importance, but he was a shitty worker who relied basically on fireballs and pencil stabbing, whereas the Iron Sheik was a much more fun character for me. So I'm all about Khosrow Vaziri.
Original Sheik was the promoter of Detroit, wasn't he? Yes,
he was.
Okay. Yeah, I like this match too. As we got higher in the card, the quality of wrestling definitely got better.
But did you also notice in the pre-match interview with the U.S. Express and Captain Lou Albano that Lou Albano just has a big can of Miller in his hands while he's being interviewed?
Oh, Captain Lou.
Lou just getting sloshed backstage at every show like he used to. Not an exaggeration. That's a fact. Lou Albano just used to get hammered backstage at every show.
Lou Albano, like Vince McMahon's crazy uncle. It's like, we got to take care of Lou. And that's the thing. Back then, there were guys that were part of his dad's promotion. Like Gorilla.
Two guys in this match: Lou Albano and Freddie Blassie.
Yeah, and it's like for a lot of years, and to a degree, years to come, even as far as like making sure guys got into rehab and stuff like that. Like Vince took care of people he considered part of the family. I think like Moolah.
Your aunt that you didn't know all that stuff about.
Yeah, I was going to say, to unfortunately, to the horror of lots of other women, he took care of Moolah. I'm not saying this was all perfect and all wonderful, but I'm saying, shady shit aside, there were people Vince was very loyal to, and Lou Albano was one of them.
Yeah, he was. Again, Lou and Blassie both. But there was some really great hot sequences in this that they didn't get a lot of time. They got like 7 minutes. But they crammed a lot into those 7 minutes. There were great exchanges from Windham and Rotundo with quick tags and nice babyface fire offense. When Sheik and Volkov got control and really kind of knocked these guys back, Rotundo played the babyface in peril really well, actually. Mm-hmm. And this is like the peak of Mike Rotundo for me because I pretty much hate him and everything else he ever did after this.
You didn't like IRS?
The gimmick was fine, and I guess he played it well, but at this... His work style was very much 1970s and the 1980s. It was starting to pass him by. So by the 90s, he was very much not my cup of tea and just seemed like a guy in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Well, I think a lot of guys kind of went the JYD route. They realized that they can get by with, in Hulk Hogan. Like, Hulk Hogan and JYD were sort of ahead of their time in realizing, and John Cena would get this way as well. When you suddenly realize you have to do very, very little in order to win over the crowd.
Very little. It's the stuff he was doing was just blah.
Okay.
Like that's the thing. Like you're talking about a guy who's what did he use for a finish as IRS? It was the write-off. It was literally a clothesline off the ropes, not the top rope, mind you. He was hitting the ropes and flying at you with a clothesline. Like, okay, you're this great amateur wrestler from the Varsity Club and all this. That's what you're doing for a finish.
By the way, every time I see footage of the Varsity Club with him and Kevin Sullivan, I just retch. Like, that looks so... I know some people, treasure the Varsity Club. It's not my thing. First of all, I like Demon Kevin Sullivan. I like Satan Kevin Sullivan. I don't like Varsity Club Kevin Sullivan.
No, I mean, Rick Steiner, sure. Dr. Death, sure. The other two, not so much.
Yeah, no.
But again, in this match, and teaming with Barry, especially, because Barry's, at this point in time, probably one of the 5 best workers in wrestling, they're a great match. And they match up so well with the Sheik and Volkov, where you have the Sheik with this devastating amateur-style offense with the suplexes and stretching guys, and Volkov, who's still this big powerhouse, versus this very technically gifted team that's quick and agile, a lot of double-team type maneuvers. And, again, to get the win, the Dastardly Heels use Freddie Blassie's cane to whack Barry in the back of the head and put him out. So the crowd gets real hot about that. But it is a very good match. And of note, depending on which version of the show you watch, if you're watching the network version, you get edited music. The U.S. Express initially used Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen.
More people don't understand that song.
Yeah. However, they were then gifted a new song by a guy named Rick Derringer.
Oh, Girls in Cars.
That was called Real American. That they would walk to the ring to.
Who got Girls in Cars then?
That was Strikeforce.
I was close.
That's a couple years down the road, and yes, it is still the greatest entrance song of all time. But these guys had a song called Real American that you might associate with somebody else. Reason being, a couple months after this, Barry's going to quit the Federation and get replaced in the team by Dan Spivey. As a result, they don't want to. They invested all this money in this song, and there's not money in Dan Spivey at this point in time. We're not doing that. They transfer the song over to this other guy named Hulk Hogan, who had been using Eye of the Tiger based on his association with the movie Rocky III, and then eventually got an instrumental cut of the Bonnie Tyler song Ravishing, which is dope. I highly recommend anybody listen to it. But yeah, that's the transfer of the song Real American, because there were big plans for Mike and Barry, but Barry just didn't want that road schedule, and it snapped and he quit.
Just as an aside, Nikolai Volkov is going to be known in the years to come as the idiot who sings the Russian national anthem until someone cuts him off or boos him or whatever. This guy in the next year is going to wrestle main events with Hulk Hogan. I just want to put that out there. Like, this guy's
been wrestling main events since 1976.
There's this window here where you look at this and you look at what they're going to become post that window that I'm referring to, and you're like, oh, what a bunch of silly cartoon characters. But right within this window, man, you have such marquee main event talent that, like you just talked about Sheik, he could go, Volkov could go, you had Hogan before he realizes what he can get away with, has his working shoes on. It's like, it's hard to believe that the WWE actually had good working talent back then.
Because then we get our next match.
That's the best thing about this match is what was happening behind the scenes. Okay? Because we talked, like, every once in a while, like, one of the staples in the internet wrestling community in terms of blogs and websites are lists, and specifically lists about what people think were works that turned into shoots. That's a big thing people like to write about. So, like, Andre the Giant legit hated Big John Studd. Big John Studd, not a fan of Andre the Giant. And they somehow had to work together in this career versus $15,000 body slam challenge.
And they worked together for the better part of 3 years. Good Lord, poor John Studd.
Yeah, I'm sure by the end of that, John Studd was in therapy. Just talk about behind the match itself is what it is. Andre the Giant's not exactly Rey Mysterio.
It's not terrible considering who's in it at the time it's in. It's really not.
Right.
Shockingly.
The gimmick is the gimmick is they're trying to body slam each other, and so it's kind of working each other over to get to the point where they can do that and selling it and teasing it and whatnot. But what's really fun about this, and this is what I want you to talk about, is what all the reason, the obvious answer is, well, they're both big guys, and, it's kind of what I was talking about before, where you see competition on the
eloquent pre-match introduction didn't really sell you?
So tell us about the behind-the-scenes stuff between Andre and John Studd. John Studd, fresh off his run in Mid-South.
I believe, actually, John was in Mid-Atlantic prior to the WWF, not Mid-South. Okay. But, again, Andre came in, and Andre was the Giant. Mm-hmm. Andre was not a big man. Andre was legitimately a giant of a man. Okay?
And still growing.
Yeah. So there were certain things that infringed on Andre's standing as the giant of wrestling. And it's not even so much that Andre didn't necessarily just like any other big guys. Like Andre was known not to get along with Blackjack Mulligan, who was a very large man. They had some run-ins outside the ring. Andre initially worked a lot with Don Leo Jonathan, who was called the Mormon Giant, but Don Leo Jonathan was only 6'7" compared to Andre, who was a legit 7-footer. But there were certain, and then anytime there was a new, young, very large human being on the way up, Andre would get a little insecure about his spot and didn't like that somebody else was coming into his vein, in his world. John Studd being one of them. John Studd initially, when he comes up, is about 6'7", close to that 300-pound mark. He's trained under Killer Kowalski. John got involved with taking human growth hormone because John had a legitimate want to be a giant. This didn't sit real well with Andre, who was the giant, and there was no one going to take his place. And I forget who told the story. I think it might have been Ken Patera or Bill Eadie, one of those guys who was around those two guys a lot. One thing Andre did not want anybody to do was when they entered the ring to walk over the top rope. To step over the top rope, I should say. That was Andre's deal. John did this, and it set Andre off. And Andre would beat the shit out of him in the ring. And Andre was known for hazing new big guy. He did it to Hulk Hogan for a long time, especially when they were in Japan. Andre would bounce beer cans off the back of his head from the back of the bus. And you kind of had to just take it because no one was messing with Andre and no one was messing with his spot. But eventually there was a point where you'd earn Andre's respect at a certain point in time, which Hogan did. John Studd never did. And part of it was because, one, John wanted to be a giant when there already was the giant. He did things in the match that Andre didn't like, that it was known he didn't like, and John did them anyway for whatever reason. And King Kong Bundy told a story that John would, like, kiss Andre's ass in the locker room. That, like, somebody would walk up to him and say, hey, John, how we doing? He goes, well, if boss is good, we're all good, right, boss? Which Andre wanted people, Andre would call you boss if he liked you, and you'd call him boss back if you were friends. And Andre would just look at him like, whatever. So there was not a good relationship there between Andre and John Studd, to the point where even when Andre is very broken down and immobile in 1989, and Studd makes his comeback as a babyface to work against Heel Andre, John Studd lasts from January till June and then quits because he does not want to continue working with Andre.
Wow. And by the way, early on during these years, another guy who's going to work with Hogan in main events. He'll get. I think he does at least one Saturday night's main event, and I want to know. And I'm 90% certain they did a house show circuit.
Studd worked a lot with Hogan on the house shows. I know Studd's first main event initially, actually at Madison Square Garden against Hogan, was not supposed to be Studd. It was supposed to be Jesse Ventura. And Jesse had to be pulled off the card due to blood clots in his lungs, and that was actually Bobby Heenan's debut in Madison Square Garden. He was supposed to manage Jesse Ventura. John Studd became the last-minute substitute, and Heenan managed John Studd through the rest of his run up until John Studd disappears briefly before WrestleMania 3. And Bobby Heenan is a lot of what makes this rivalry interesting and fun. Let's be fair.
Yeah, Bobby Heenan is the most memorable part of this match for me. Because you have... So Andre finally slams John Studd in a little less than 6 minutes, and he's got the bag. And I remember this as a kid. I still have fond memories of it. It was fun to rewatch it again. He's got the bag of money, and he was just like, flowers for Algernon. He's just throwing money into the audience, and there's Bobby Heenan, like a thief in the night, running up to him, just steals the bag and runs away. Just, so good. Bobby Heenan is the best.
And that's really the story of this, is Andre's career is on the line. If he can't slam John Studd within this time limit, he's going to have to retire. The novelty is John Studd, to this point, nobody has seen get slammed, and the crowd's thinking Andre is the man to do it, but he has to do it within this time window. Mm-hmm. And you've got the nefarious Bobby Heenan who stirred all this up. They've cut Andre's hair on TV. They've done everything they could to try to embarrass him. Now Andre's not only out for revenge, but his career. And again, in the match, there's actually a good little bit of story. Like Andre does some leg work with, some leg kicks before anybody knew what they were. And there's a decent amount of selling. It's a lot of what you would expect from this in certain parts. A lot of plotting, forearm heavy offense and some bear hugs and things of that. But the slam is at least built to the point where the audience can enjoy it and pop when it does happen.
Yep. I want to take a brief moment here and talk about the backstage, or where he was centered in doing the interviews was on the way to ringside.
Lord Alfred.
Oi! They clearly had a bunch of pre-tapes that they edited into the show, because no one's wearing the same outfit they are when they do the backstage interviews with Mean Gene, and then they would do another interview with Lord Alfred Hayes as they were running to the ring. And I have to ask, because I remember Lord Alfred Hayes from Prime Time, and Lord Alfred Hayes is kind of the Ed McMahon character, smooth as silk, just having a grand old time, very much in his element. You know, he could yes now as much as Ed McMahon with the best of them. He looks like a deer in the fucking headlights on this show. He looks like he had never been in front of a camera before, and they're like, "We need you to go out there and interview wrestlers." Oh! Like, what the hell, man?
Yeah, he was not comfortable at any point. There's a lot of, stuttering and stammering and kind of stumbling over words, and
I think I'm thinking of like the Kentucky Fried Movie, or it might be another one where he's just this really uncomfortable reporter in front of the camera who doesn't know what to do.
And again, we're used to, oh my word, yes, of course, promotional consideration paid for by the following.
Yeah, I get it.
We're used to that Alfred Hayes, and instead of being the guy who just can't put a coherent sentence together.
He looked like at any given moment he thought a wrestler was going to hit him.
Yeah, and maybe that's because of Matt Bourne earlier in the show, where I think it's when Beefcake and Johnny V are making their entrance. They walk past Alfred Hayes, and Matt Bourne's walking up to get back to the back at that point, and he almost cuts in front of Hayes in front of the camera, and then realizes where he is, because I guess maybe there's a stagehand waving to him to go the other way, so he has to stop, turn around, and walk around the back of Lord Alfred Hayes to go back. I don't know if it's maybe because they were doing it live and Alfred came from very much a pre-tape era, but he was just super uncomfortable. And he's never performed like that again, to my knowledge.
No.
My memories of him at these WrestleManias, but he just, I don't know if it was maybe the spectacle and he got a little stage fright.
Well, I don't think they ever used him like that. Everything else felt like it was a little bit more controlled, a little bit more pre-planned, where, like, here he's in kind of that Gene Okerlund role where your job is to sit there and react and hold a mic, and he's not comfortable with it. Like, you're absolutely right. When I think it's a more controlled environment and he knows about what's going to happen and how to react to things, he's fine. When he has to be extemporaneous, no, that's not his bag. So now we get to our co-main event, Wendy Richter with Cyndi Lauper versus the current champion who had just beaten Wendy Richter at the aforementioned show, Leilani Kai with the Fabulous Lula. Wendy Richter, who I keep confusing with Rockin' Robin because I keep thinking, when isn't Wendy Richter related to Jake Roberts? No, that's Rockin' Robin. So Wendy Richter came from where? Because she is super southern.
She's originally from Texas. Started her career actually as the Texas Cowgirl Wendy Richter and was a heel. Because she was very tall and very muscular, so she was seen as kind of a bully type character.
Yeah, she's a big girl.
She wrestled in the AWA predominantly. Did do a few WWF spots tours as part of ladies tag team matches. But somewhere along the way, Wendy was a little bit different than your average female wrestler in that Wendy was actually a good looking woman and in really good shape.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Vince having the foresight to see that, hey, we could really kind of capitalize on this type of relationship if we got a female Hulk Hogan and we can get the girls involved. And he thought Richter was the perfect choice for that because, again, not to slight the other women at the time, but they were not necessarily into the rigorous level of training that Wendy put forth to garner the physique she did. They looked very much more in the vein of a Moolah or her opponent in this match, Leilani Kai, who, again, pioneer in women's wrestling, Leilani Kai, but Leilani Kai not ever known for having, a real sculpted or sexy physique in either of the type, way to say it.
She looks like a house mom. And
yeah, which was very much the norm physique for women wrestlers at the time.
Mm-hmm. Also, why Leilani Kai? Why not Mary Sue? Because she don't look like no Leilani Kai. That ain't come on, I want to lay it right there.
No, but you know, how many Mary Sues are going to get booked versus somebody with a name like Leilani Kai?
Okay,
are you booking Mary Sue or are you booking Leilani Kai? I'm booking Leilani Kai. Why?
I get that, but she don't look no Hawaiian. She looks like my neighbor.
Yeah, but she's wearing a lei.
Oh, is that all it takes? Okay.
That's all it takes. Jay Strongbow wasn't a Native American.
He looked more native than not, though. He could get look. The Yokozuna. Okay, the Yokozuna, you could at least somewhat buy. He had, as a Samoan, some Asian features. That woman looked like she should have been, running to a PTA meeting. I watched this match and I'm like,
how about Chris Champion as Yoshi Kwan?
I give up. You win.
Okay, all right. But yes, Wendy was very much not the typical lady wrestler that we had been used to for years and years and years. She was very different, and Vince sought to capitalize on that. Because she was a good-looking woman with a really strong physique and was a pretty good athlete comparatively to the other women at the time, where we talked about this a little earlier with the brawl to end it all. Lots of women's wrestling was very sloppy pull-downs and pullovers and awkward hair-pulling exchanges and not really any type of real athleticism involved.
Right.
And unfortunately, this is a meshing of that.
So let me ask you, because we're going to leap forward in just a bit, because there were big plans for Wendy, but, the other infamous screw job, as everyone likes to refer to it, they're going to put the belt back on Moolah, who was a masked wrestler playing the Spider Lady at the time, which is the end of Wendy in the WWE. And what exactly went wrong here? Where did things go off the rails, where we have the female Hulk Hogan to, fuck her, we got to put the belt back on Grandma?
So I'd say step one was that she married Hugo Savinovich, who really didn't help her career in any type of way. Just garnered her a lot of heat because he wasn't very popular. How this guy ever got married to Wendy Richter, I have no idea either, because he's a frumpy, fat Puerto Rican guy and she was a babe. So who goes figures? Anyways,
the heart knows what it wants.
Yeah, the dick does too. So anyways, Wendy's going to win the title back in this in a big crowning moment. Celebrates with Cyndi Lauper in the middle of the Garden. Really big moment. She is a huge star and is main eventing house shows in certain markets, including Madison Square Garden. And she wrestles a couple of instances with this masked Spider Lady, who is at various points in time played by different workers. And Richter's claim at this point is that her contract was up and Vince wanted her to sign a new deal, but they were constantly arguing about compensation, and Wendy felt she was getting lowballed on the payoffs that they had agreed to. And at a certain point, the idea was floated that, she's getting too big for her britches. We need to nip this in the bud before it gets worse. So what they did was, instead of having the regular performer, who I think at the time might have been Donna Christianello, I could be wrong, who was performing as a Spider Lady with Wendy, they brought in Moolah. And Wendy said she was surprised that Moolah was backstage because Moolah never showed up to shows she wasn't booked on. Didn't know Moolah was going to be the Spider Lady. Gets into the ring to wrestle Spider Lady, and I would have to assume as soon as she got into the ring and locked up, she knew it was Moolah.
Sure.
I could see her not knowing that when she was going to the ring and everything, but you have to know that that's Moolah, especially with how much she worked with her.
Yeah.
The thought being that Moolah's tough enough that she's going to be able to hold Wendy down in a pin. That doesn't happen. She holds Wendy down for a 1 count. Wendy's clearly out of the pin, and the referee continues and counts to 3. Wendy's pissed, legitimately and rightfully so, takes a swipe at the referee, who gets out of there, goes after the Spider Lady, who she's pretty confident in knowing who she is, but she wants to ruin the illusion, yanks the mask off the Spider Lady, and of course it's Moolah. Takes a yank at Moolah's hair and takes a swing at her. Moolah gets away. Wendy, in her wrestling gear, catches a cab out of Madison Square Garden and a flight out of Kennedy and never speaks to Moolah again. And thus the experiment to try to create a female Hulk Hogan will end for a long time.
The WWF for over 50 years cutting off its nose despite its face. You know, the irony about Vince McMahon is come to the WWE with this opportunity. You get paid much more money than you will anywhere else. You'll have the opportunity to have a vast fortune. Okay.
Goddamn, pal.
I want you to pay me a lot of money. Whoa, easy cat. Whoa, Nelly. I don't actually want to pay you. I'm just saying there's the opportunity.
Yeah, pretty much what it comes to. But you know, this is one of those times where knowing what Richter was and how big of a deal she was, I have a very hard time not siding with her through this whole thing. There's a lot of times where someone's clearly on an ego trip and thinking they're a much bigger deal than they are. I'm sorry. I have all the respect in the world for Arn Anderson as an in-ring performer. Him and Tully thinking they were worth more money to the WWF than Demolition, I laugh at.
Well, I think about the conversation we had about the Warrior, and he went to Vince and said, I believe you should pay me this much, and Vince agreeing to it and then not doing it. And then, gee whiz, the Warrior's like, well, then I'm not working. How does that sound? You got to pick one. Either agree, in the case of Wendy Richter and him going, well, I'm not going to pay you that much money and you can go fuck yourself. Okay. At least you've made a decision and stuck with it. I don't agree with it, but you're the one running the $1 million company, not me. The case of the Warrior where he agrees to it and then doesn't do it, and as you talked about with some of these other promoters, as he would, go on to buy promotion after promotion and territory after territory of him reneging on deals, boy, Vince McMahon, a complicated character.
Machiavellian, as it were.
Indeed. All right. Before we get to our main event here, I do want to.
We should note though. We should talk a little bit about the Wendy Richter Leilani Kai match, shouldn't we?
Oh shit! Go ahead. What did you think of this match?
It's very clunky, and
yeah, it is.
If you compare it to, say, women's wrestling today, I think the last time I watched this match before like this review, it was probably sometime around. I think me and a friend were trying to watch like a lot of old WrestleManias in the build up to whichever show it was in 2016. Mm-hmm. And we were hanging out. We were watching SmackDown on a Tuesday, and it's funny because Brian Zane talks about this too in his review. There was a match between Becky and Carmella, and Becky's a very polished, very good worker even at that point. Carmella's not. She's got development to do, but they're miles ahead of what we get in this match. I think there's one spot that pops me is Wendy has Leilani Kai, who's a hefty girl, up on her shoulders. And Wendy hits like a reverse kind of FU to Leilani Kai. I was like, oh, that was pretty good, But other than that, it's very rough. The finish is Leilani Kai comes off with a crossbody, and Wendy almost rolls through it. And eventually just rolls Leilani Kai off of her and gets on top of her in a north-south position for a pin. Yeah.
Yeah, this was one of those where the idea of Wendy Richter worked out better than the match with Wendy Richter.
And yet she would still, after the screw job, appear on the Rock and Wrestling cartoon 1 year later.
Oh, wow. That was post the screw job?
That was post. That came on in 1986.
Well, I guess they had already had it animated in the can. There wasn't much they could do about it at the time.
Featuring notable voices as Brad Garrett as Hulk Hogan and James Avery as the Junkyard Dog.
I remember watching that cartoon on Saturday mornings. It's one of my favorites. All right, as I was trying to say before, I do want to tell our listeners about Grammarly. Grammarly is offering a free download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2M Network. Again, that's getgrammarly.com/W2M Network to download Grammarly for free. And now we come to it. The main event. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T with murderer Jimmy Snuka versus Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper with Bob Orton in the perpetual cast. All right, so everyone knows that he has the cast. It's been brought up. I mean, it's become more associated with him than his actual name, Cowboy Bob Orton. What happened that Bob Orton got the cast, and why did he never take it off again?
Bob broke his arm, legitimately, in a match with Jimmy Snuka that was at the Philadelphia Spectrum, I believe. Now, you have options at this point in time as far as what you want to do. Do you want to take time off or do you want to keep going? Bob at the time is involved in angles with Jimmy Snuka and Hulk Hogan, making a lot of money. Money you're probably not going to see again in the second go-around. So Bob continues to work with the cast on. Essentially, the cast is not a gimmick because Bob legitimately has a partially broken forearm that is not healing because he keeps working. And he keeps the cast on for forever until finally the bone eventually fuses because it just has to at a certain point. It has no choice because it's in this cast. But Bob is working with a broken arm the whole time because he's making more money than he's ever going to see. It's the same reason why Paul Orndorff today has kind of a completely atrophied arm on one side and a muscular one on the other because he'll be working on top with Hogan in a few months after this and gets nerve damage in his neck but doesn't want to stop because he's making obscene amounts of money. That's what happened to Bob, and they decided to incorporate this cast because he's going to constantly have it on into the gimmick where they do the TNT sketch where he visits a doctor who says your arm is not broken, and Piper calls him a quack, and it became synonymous with him to the point where they liked it so much they reused it years later with Owen Hart.
Right. I can remember that. All right, so this match is just Cuckoo Bananas. It is almost 15 minutes long. It's a lot of... It's kind of like with Brutus and Valiant and the San Martinos. There's a lot of shit happening. It's a very frenetic, weirdo, running all over the place, lots of shit happening in the ring kind of match. And to Mr. T's credit, like, this isn't the kind of, like Hulk Hogan, Dennis Rodman... DDP, Karl Malone thing where they're trying to keep them out of the ring as much as possible, and it's like, okay, let him in, do an arm drag, get him the hell out of the ring again. Like, Mr. T and Piper really go at it here. This was fun to watch.
For all the dislike that Piper had towards T, legitimately, he really did make him look good in the exchanges they had in the ring.
Yeah, they actually had they actually started off with like a grappling match. Like Piper, who's known for dirty tricks and thumbs to the eyes and stuff like that. He shoots for the leg. There's a go behind. Mr. T sits out and escapes. I mean, like, they were wrestling for real. It's good stuff.
He hits him with hip tosses and slams, and I remember Piper saying that the goal with T was to keep everything amateur because if they let him throw a punch, it's going to expose them as being complete phonies.
Right.
And to be fair, we'll see that play out in a year from now. But again, the goal was you had to make T look credible when he was in there. So part of that is, yes, letting him get some very basic but credible offense in, and then transition to take him down, hold him down, stomp him and kick him until you tag in Hulk, who can carry the ball.
My other favorite thing about this is at one point Roddy Piper and Paul end up deciding they don't want to be in the match anymore, and they just fuck off and leave. And I forget why, but they're turned around and forced to go back or whatever. And I'll tell you, Hulk Hogan, what a ham! He's sitting he's in the ring and he's leaning over the ropes and he's practically begging them to get back in the ring. He's like holding the rope down and he's doing the come on man. Say what you will about Hulk Hogan and his unsavory behavior in later years, but...
I don't know what you're referring to.
Don't worry about it. Gosh, these early Hulk Hogan years are truly a treasure. You can absolutely see, being fair to the man and not being a work rate snob, how he was the biggest star in the company at the time. Just phenomenal.
No, I think that's very fair. He's charisma. He is a 6'8", 300-pound ball of charisma.
Mm-hmm. He knows what to do in there. They talk about this a lot now. Like Jim Cornette talks about this, where they can teach a guy moves, but you can't teach him how to be you can't necessarily teach him how to be a wrestler. You can try. You can have Dusty Rhodes talk to him all, till the cows come home. But but some of them are going to get it. And so some of them are never going to get it. Some of them are going to think it's all about moves. It's not. If you look at what, Hogan has talked about this, like knowing when to engage the crowd, knowing when not to engage the crowd, knowing when to cut somebody off, knowing when to sell for them. It's not about just doing a move and selling and doing a move and selling and doing a move and selling.
When are you doing it? Why are you doing it?
Right. And I'll tell you, for all the crap Hogan gets about his work and style and all of that, was there anyone who knew better what to do in that ring and when to do it than him at that time?
Very, very difficult to find a better, I won't say overall ring psychologist, because you got to mention guys like Jake Roberts at that point, but a crowd psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
Hogan is just, he's John Williams standing in front of an orchestra.
Yeah. I mean, people could talk about, like, well, he's a big guy, and he was super steroidy, and he was blonde, and he was white, and, he had all these things going for him. What, how could he not be the head of the company? But you could put all of those attributes on a guy who doesn't know what he's doing in there, and they're not going to be Hulk Hogan. It's going to fall apart.
And we get to a debate point in this, as big and heroic and loved as Hogan was. How much of that is derivative from hate towards Roddy Piper?
Go on.
Because Piper is willing to say and do things that most people aren't at this point in time.
Uh-huh. And some of it will be scrubbed from Peacock.
Yes, it will. But even then, you're talking about, like I said, in January at Madison Square Garden, in the span of 30 seconds, with Dick Clark, who's a major celebrity of all time, in the ring, he slaps Lou Albano and breaks a record over his head when they're talking about a presentation for muscular dystrophy relief. Legitimately kicks Cyndi Lauper. He was a man kicking a woman, and not just any woman, but at the time one of the two biggest female pop stars on the planet, along with Madonna. And I think at this point in time, it's fair to say Cyndi was bigger than Madonna before she gets eclipsed.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that to try to people forget what it was in that time.
Cyndi Lauper was a bigger star than Madonna was until Madonna, I think, gets to like a Virgin, which is not. I have to look it up, but I feel like in the beginning, when Madonna is still kind of a club act, yeah, Cyndi Lauper is the bigger star.
Yeah, so it's again, not saying that to try to start. It's just how it was at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
You go back to that, but he kicked her, slammed her boyfriend in a way that didn't look like a professional wrestling slam because Dave Wolf didn't know how to work.
Mm-hmm.
Piper just picks him up and really shovels him hard into the mat to make it look good. And again, you talk about him doing things like Mr. T would get under his skin because he had an entourage and did things a certain way. They go to the first WrestleMania press conference, and Mr. T was one of those guys who had rules about dealing with him, where one of the things was you don't touch him. You don't shake his hand unless he shakes your hand. You don't put your hands on his shoulders or anything. Piper gets to the first press conference at, I think it was, I forget where it was in Times Square, what the venue was at the time. It's gone through changes since then. Been the All-Star Cafe, the Hard Rock, etc. It might have been the Hard Rock at that time, but they have the first official press conference, and Piper's late, and to get to his chair, he has to walk past Mr. T on the seating platform. And as he's walking towards T, T flexes his bicep and says, "Oh, pretty hard, huh?" And Piper grabs each side of Mr. T's head and says, "Pretty soft, huh?" And T goes for, a double leg, and then the whole thing falls apart.
Like a Virgin, by the way, came out in '84. I'd have to look and see when Girls Just Want to Have Fun came out.
I believe it was also, I think that was late '83. Okay. So they're neck and neck, kind of.
Yeah, they are. In any case, last words about this match, and then we'll close up for the night. Let me just say that for spectacle, for excitement, for freneticness, for the kind of thing that would appeal to a mass audience, not a hardcore niche Southern wrestling fan, this was great. When like 411 and some of these other internet wrestling sites do like their lists of WrestleMania, this one always ranks low. And I'm looking back on it, and like, boy, are you judging this against like later WrestleManias and not really looking at it in context.
Yeah, and again, people try to act like it was a glorified MSG house show. MSG house shows had 20-minute time limit draws opening the show with job guys, and maybe in a really special circumstance, 2 title matches on it. Not every champion in the company being active on the same card, every champion in the company fighting with marquee talent of the same level. Like Greg Valentine didn't wrestle a job guys Intercontinental Champion; he wrestled the Junkyard Dog. Right. The World Tag Team Championship was between the 2 top teams in the company. Hogan is in the spectacle of all spectacles, tag teaming with Mr. T against Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff. And then you have your women's champion, often the forgotten championship on this show, Wendy Richter, who again is almost as big a star as Hogan is at this point in time, defending her title against the woman actually competing for the title against the woman who took it from her.
Right.
With Cindy Lauper in their
corner. Are there really people who call this a glorified house show? Because those people are assholes.
There are people who feel this was a glorified MSG house show just with the celebrity effect involved. And again,
but this is why I wanted to lay out the history, because how do you look at this card and not see that this was the superstar, this was the super all-stars of wrestling minus Ric Flair at the time? Like, that's ridiculous.
I mean, there's certain names obviously not on this card that weren't affiliated with the WWF.
Sure.
But at the time, let's look at the WWF roster. What top WWF talent is missing?
Right. Because Savage doesn't come until after this.
Yeah, there's nobody missing from this at the time. Right. Even Jimmy Snuka and Bob Orton, who were not booked as wrestlers, but they were involved in the main event. Slaughter's gone at this point.
Terry Funk shows up later.
Who's that?
Terry Funk shows up later.
Yeah, Terry's abbreviated run happens later. But Dusty's not there. Flair's in the NWA. Bockwinkel's in the AWA. Backlund's gone. He's kind of figuring out his life at this point. This is really the who's who of the WWF at this point in time. This is it. This is Hogan. This is Andre. This is Piper. This is Studd. This is Orndorff. This is Wendy Richter. This is Ricky Steamboat and Tito Santana on the way up. This is
so a couple of noticeable names missing, but they might not come until later. Where's Don Morocco?
Morocco is a notable name missing from this show. However, Morocco at this point in time, unfortunately, is kind of being phased out as a top guy.
I was going to say, because didn't he just have the run with Snuka that ended in the Garden with Snuka jumping off the
No,
stage?
that ended in the fall of 1983.
Okay.
His next big run after that is with Rocky Johnson in 84, and then Tito, who takes the Intercontinental title from him. Morocco's kind of taken off TV for a little while. He does have a 3-house show run with Hogan and is the first guy to sell out the Garden with Hogan in a title defense.
All right, speaking of Rocky Johnson, where's he at?
Not in the WWF at this point in time.
Tony Atlas.
Independent of the WWF, he's not technically working at this point anywhere, but is not unaffiliated. He'll be back in the WWF next year.
That's all I can think of.
Yeah, Slaughter at this point is gone to the AWA because of the G.I. Joe Hasbro thing. The Hart Foundation is not yet a team. The Bulldogs are not a team yet. Trying to think who else that there was.
Do you know if Vince reached out to the Road Warriors? Or were they locked up somewhere?
At this point in time, they are contracted to Verne. They went to the AWA in 1984 and were contracted there through mid-86.
Okay.
He will meet with them as soon as he can, but that's not for a little while.
Right. And in the meantime, he'll create a team just like them until he can get them for sure.
Yeah, and steal another one that is like them. I'm trying to think of who else at the point in time. Like I said, Backlund's gone.
There's a distinct lack of Samoans on this show. We have no wild Samoans. We have no.
They had finished up their run the year prior, working with Dick Murdoch and Adrian Adonis. Maybe Adonis stands out, but Adonis wasn't a huge star. And this is at a point in time where Adrian is actually getting into trouble because of his lack of commitment to his physique, where he'll soon be rechristened Adorable Adrian Adonis.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, in between here and like WrestleMania 3, he starts the flower shop and he's putting on makeup and wearing pink tights and all that and being a fat slob. Like he loses the leather jacket shortly after this, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's going to happen on Piper's Pit. But again, we really do have the who's who of the WWF at this point.
Right.
and again, there's a burgeoning talent influx again in '85 where we get, Randy Savage and all these other guys who come in, but they're not there yet. So you have the best of the best that the WWF for the most part has to offer at this point.
Yeah. So for those of you who look at this as a glorified house show,
there was no Jose Estrada versus Iron Mike Sharp for 20 minutes. There was no 20-man battle royal with 6 guys who you never heard of. This wasn't just throwing on everybody for the sake of everything. There was purpose to each of the matches booked on this show. Yep. We want to get Tito to get the crowd happy to start the show. We want to introduce and get Ricky Steamboat over. We want to pop the crowd for this tag team match. We want to use
George the Animal Steel.
He's in the midst of a gimmick change.
Okay.
So he's at this point still technically a heel, but he's not being used as much because they're going to transition him into lovable idiot George.
Missing link.
Not a major part of the WWF at this point in time, and didn't last very long because he wasn't well liked by people backstage, mostly Bobby Heenan.
Corporal Kirshner.
Not yet introduced, I believe.
Okay. Ken Patera.
Waukesha, Wisconsin jail.
Unavailable. Got it. Anything else, Pat?
That on purpose.
Anything else, Pat? Anything else you want to say about this show before we close
Yeah,
out?
I have to put over the commentary team.
No, Gorilla and Jesse are great. Actually, before you do, let me address that really quick because I did want to bring this up now that you mention it. Jesse becomes a huge dick over the next couple of years where he's just ridiculous. And I remember this one show where he's so mad by the end of it. He's like, I'm so mad right now. I'm thinking about getting back in there. And I might have actually been WrestleMania 3 now that I think about it, where he's like he just wants to kill Hulk Hogan. He's not bad here. Like, him and Gorilla have great chemistry together, and he is slightly heelish, but he's not over-the-top, ridiculous cartoon character heel like he's going to become shortly.
Also, one of the only times you'll hear someone on air call Gorilla Monsoon Gino.
Interesting. Okay.
Which was, he was known, his name was Robert Morella, but all of his close friends called him Gino. And Jesse on commentary calls him Gino. Okay. The only other person I recall ever calling him Gino on screen in any way was Bruno, when Bruno was fully into his mid-'80s comeback trying to get David back in good graces. But look at that, too. You even go to the past and you bring Bruno out for this.
Right. Yeah, people are ridiculous. Anything else about the commentary team?
Just, this was really the first high-profile pairing of Gorilla and Jesse as a team. And they were so good together. They really played off of each other well. Any type of hyperbole from Jesse, Gorilla could shut down and, reiterate it. Jesse could bring in the logical point. They were both ex-grapplers who could lend that expertise into parts of the match to tie you in. Jesse, again, like you said, not fully blown over the top heel Jesse, but subtle enough where he was getting very good at it.
Also not dressing like he got dressed in the dark in a drag queen's closet.
No, not on this one. Very understated for the body.
Yeah. He wore a t-shirt.
You tell me. Yeah, not a lot of bicuspid Jesse that we get today. Very different guy back then. Worth listening to then.
Yeah, no, he's great. He actually provides some interesting insight into the match as opposed to just kind of doing years later he would do it better. And I know you're in love with this guy, so. Mr. Perfect on commentary was always hilarious, and he was doing the Jesse the Body, all the bad guys are always great and everything they do is perfect thing, but he was funny about it, and he wasn't nearly as over the top.
No, but I still, for my money, Jesse's the best ever at doing this.
Okay.
Jesse's prime years to me, whether he was working with Gorilla, whether he was especially working with Vince.
He tortured McMahon. He was hilarious.
I just think Jesse was magic at all times from that WWF commentary run of 85 to 90. I just think Jesse was the best.
Gorilla and Jesse or Gorilla and Bobby?
Gorilla and Jesse is a better team to get things over. Gorilla and Bobby are more funny.
Yeah, they were. All right, Pat.
I think that's a fair assessment of their abilities.
Well, that is the end of the Mania of WrestleMania. Next Thursday, a week and a day from tonight, myself and Pat will be doing the epilogue to our boxing series, Modern Times. We're going to look at Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder, and we're going to do a spit shine on everybody else. And then WrestleMania 2, the Mania of WrestleMania 2.
Boy, that one's going to be sure.
Chris Bailey wants to join us for that, and so hopefully we'll be able to get that done Monday, May 10th. And then we'll start to plot these out as time goes on. I don't like to plot them too far in advance because, Pat's not always available. But that's okay.
And also the fact that I have to watch WrestleMania 2 for this.
Did you get Bailey's email? Did you see the thing that he sent you?
I did. Well, I don't want to spoil too much about what we get to talk about with the original satellite feed that hasn't been edited.
I'm excited for this, man. Nassau Coliseum, my old stomping grounds.
There's some things in there that Peacock wouldn't necessarily let fly.
Oh, I'm excited for this now. Very excited. All right, so that's it. So this has been a part of our WrestleMania Week coverage. We reviewed NXT Stand and Deliver on Monday, and we took I briefly mentioned NXT UK Prelude because I was the only one that watched it. We reviewed WrestleMania 37 yesterday, and we touched on the Hall of Fame and we had a debate of whether or not WrestleMania should be a one-night event, a two-night event, or a week-long event like I pitched. Every day is WrestleMania. And that way, when we actually get to WrestleMania, it's only 4 hours long because I can't do shows longer than that. I can't stand it. But while doing all of these WrestleMania shows, we've had some other shows drop. We had Resident Alien, Welcome to Earth. We looked at that book. We reviewed the
Mark,
show.
There's a thing happening in Flushing, New York on this coming Saturday. I don't know if I should go to it or not, though. You tell me. At the Wrestling Universe store, there are appearances by Scott and Rick Steiner, Chris Hero, blah, Vampiro, Tully and Arn, Smilin' Kylie Ray, Rachel Ellering, and Mike McGurk.
I think, given what has occurred over the last couple of years in our private Boogie Nights chat, if you don't go to see Scott Steiner, I'll be very disappointed.
I love Scotty, but I think, as we know, I'm a bigger fan of Rick.
Either way, if they're both going to be there, double the trouble, double the fun.
Yeah, I might have to see Vampiro as well, because why not?
Vampiro. We also had our review of the Invasion from Planet WrestleTopia book, our old In Defense of the Ultimate Warrior podcast that took place after the Casual Heroes draft.
Mark, I forget, on that show, is that the one where we bring up all of the contractual fallacies that Vince did not agree to, or is that in the promoters Everyone Loves a Bad Guy? I forget.
That might be that one. I know we talked about some of the BS that went on with the Ultimate Warrior and Vince in the Unsolved Mysteries show that we did on him.
We did do a show on Unsolved Mysteries of the Warrior.
That's right, which I'm waiting to figure out when I'm going to air. Jesse dropped an Unspoken Issues today, Doom 2099, and tomorrow, despite the fact that I couldn't find a legit copy of it anywhere, I found a modulated copy on YouTube, because you can't stop me, Peacock, you can't stop me, NBC Universal. We are going to be putting No Holds Barred on trial. I will be defending, and Sean will be prosecuting.
You don't have Hulu or Netflix?
It's not on Hulu anymore.
It's on Amazon Prime, I'll guarantee you.
It's not. I checked.
You didn't want to shell out $9 to own it?
I tried. I would have absolutely bought it. I couldn't find a place to purchase it. I couldn't find a place to watch it. I had to watch a shit copy on YouTube. I'm telling you, man. I checked.
You're going to feel very silly as I pull up Amazon Prime and find out that it's on there.
If you do, I'll buy it right now on this show. This is very exciting.
I will screenshot it and send it to you once I find it.
Okay. Well, you do that. I'm going to finish my plugs here. It's Flashback Friday this Friday. We will be re-airing our 2013 review of Star Trek Into Darkness. This was the predecessor to DMU Hollywood. It was our 411 Summer Blockbuster series that Jeff Harris and I did. This is one where we didn't yell at each other. So it's fantastic. And then Saturday, during the day. Jesse is dropping another source, syndicated source material, our 107th re-airing of The Killing Joke. And then, and I don't know if are you going to watch Jake Paul versus Ben Askren?
No, why would I?
Okay. Well, I am, because I can't. I think it's fantastic. And I'm going to make Chris Bailey watch it, too, and we're going to provide commentary, hopefully. So, we'll see.
Oh, you know what, Mark? I have to apologize. For whatever reason, No Holds Barred is now unavailable on Amazon Prime.
I told you. I looked.
Is that Peacock's doing, the bastards?
I think so. I think in their Nazi-esque burning books thing that they're doing, where they're scrubbing history free of Triple H fucking a corpse and blackface and half a blackface on Roddy Piper and whatnot, that they also took away No Holds Barred. Are y'all looking for the gay bar? That's a line from the movie.
Well, if it ain't the Teeny Wangers.
So good.
God loves Stan Hansen.
Is that who that was?
That was Stan Hansen.
Oh, wow. How about that? I had no idea. All right. You got anything going on in your world that you want to talk about?
Not particularly, no.
Terrific. All right. We'll see you next week on the boxing show, and then next week for the Mania of Wrestlemania 2. For Pat Mullin, I'm Mark Radulich. Be well, be safe, and behave.